Dr. Greg Mills is one of the foremost advisors on policy on the African continent. He's also the CEO of the Brenthurst Foundation and a prolific writer. His latest book is The Asian Aspiration. And we're going to talk today about the lessons that we can glean from Asia and how to apply them to the African continent.
I'll take you back sort of 10, 11 years. I was in, excuse me, I was in Cambridge writing a book called Why Africa's Poor. Came out as 10 years ago.
I saw that, yeah.
And it was the time of the global financial crisis. So I was operating on a very limited budget. I was cycling in and out of the university 30 kilometers either way every day. And I'd just given excuse me, the first draft of the manuscript to my old professor who I was staying with. And he had panned it. He said, you'd gone back to sort of PhD mode, and he'd really ripped it apart. So I was feeling slightly sorry for myself, and I cycled into Ely on the way home, visited the cathedral, and I kind of thought, what is the central story that I'm trying to tell here in this book? And this is something that resonates in a way with this one too. It's a thread that's been pulled over this decade. And I remember where I was standing outside the cathedral when I thought, hang on a second. We always like to think that Africa is in such a worse position. It's circumstances are unique. There are many echoes with Latin America and indeed with Southeast Asia. But we always like to think it's completely unique. And we always like to think that we are in a worse position than anybody else. But there were certain advantages, whether they be a common sense of nationalism or whether it be a sense of external powers coming to help or whatever. There's always certain advantages that others had over Africa, which explains the relative disparity in development performance over the last, particularly since the end of the Cold War. And I suddenly thought to myself, well, hang on, what about Vietnam? Now, there's a country which had essentially 4 periods of colonialism. It had 1,000 years of Chinese colonialism, not a light touch by any manner of means. Then shifted to French colonialism to give it that little bit of administrative clarity that the French always bring with them. Then a short interregnum of Japanese-dominated rule during the Second World War. Then went back to France, of course, ended at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. And then the American period of, we could call it neo-colonialism, and finally got liberated in 1975. And then to add insult to injury, then spent 10 in a command economic structure which totally destroyed the last sort of vestiges, it seemed, of hope at the time. The country was devastated. 3 million people approximately had been killed in the war. It had more bombs dropped on it than by both sides during the Second World War were dropped on Vietnam. It was completely and utterly devastated. It's a long, discontiguous country. It has a very difficult topography. I cycled from the north to the south a few years ago. It's a hell of a journey because the mountains never seem to end. It has 54 different linguistic groups. It has all the reasons that in Africa we say are reasons for failure. Yet it has turned this around and turned itself into a high growth opportunity for outside investors, for people feeding off it in the region, great holiday destination, enormously welcoming people. It's a place that functions. It has a certain dysfunction, but it still functions. Now, why has Vietnam done it? And we haven't done it in Africa. And that was the basis of a much better book that I then produced 10 years ago, I'm pleased to say, as a result of that critique and as a result of that thinking. But it's also the thread that's been pulled through to the Asian Aspiration, which is really about asking the question, why not Africa, if Asia? And because that question's been asked so many times of me in the course of my work in seeking out best practice, it seemed like the natural place to go. To try and get a sense of, if Asia did it so spectacularly well, why shouldn't Africa? And the answer that we have very positively is, to get to your question, is there's no good reason.
Mm. What does the modern African leader need to look like in terms of the traits that you, in your experience and the research that you've shown or that you've done? What has that shown you?
I think we take the wrong lessons out of the dictatorial authoritarian model of Asia during the 1960s and 70s. And of course, that's already moved on from then. So we have this image in our minds of the authoritarianism of the 60s when we think that that'll be a solution to Africa's problems. And that's one of the big differences between Asia and Africa. We've had authoritarianism, and it was terrible. It was worse than what we have today. In Africa, democracies have performed much better than authoritarian systems of government, and we see this quite clearly in terms of the record. The better the democracy, the higher the rates of growth, the less volatile the growth record, the less vulnerability to commodity price swings. And that's a big difference with Asia. So the benign, benevolent dictator model as epitomized by Lee Kuan Yew doesn't work in Africa for one of the very, very good reasons is simply that when Africa has sought its benign dictators, they haven't proved to be particularly benign or particularly good. And one of the problems with dictators per se is if they prove to be useless, it's quite difficult to get rid of them. So, you know, I think it's the wrong lesson entirely. We argue this in the book. We argue that development and democracy in Africa, from the empirical record, are entwined. You can't do one without the other, at least in Africa. It provides much better governance, much more accountability, much better connection between the governed and the government. But to go to your point about what leadership qualities are necessary, I think that Lee Kuan Yew does epitomize these aside from the authoritarianism. It's about a vision. It's about having a plan, a strategy. It's about selecting priorities. It's about doing the basics very well, about getting macroeconomic stability, getting in investors, finding out what it is that they want, and giving it to them, if at all possible. It's about institutionalizing government. That's what Lee Kuan Yew did brilliantly. People often see Singapore as being him. Quite the contrary. Singapore was him, then it was Goh Chok Tong, and so the succession has continued, and he developed a meritocracy as part of that system. And that's why Singapore was so effective, because there's such high quality people all the way through government, and they're not there because of political or ethnic preferences or religious preferences. They're there because they're just very good at their job, and they're paid accordingly. And there's this sense of when you have this attention to detail, which goes with a system, is you take responsibility. So we interviewed Goh Chok Tong, his successor, and he told about tremendous fights in cabinet, difficult arguments they'd have. But when they had decided on a particular course of action, that was it. They went to the public, they said, this is what we're going to do, and they went and they implemented, to the letter, and absolutely always perfectly. So this commitment to detail and to execution of a particular idea is crucial. And it's no different to business. It's no different to anything else. It's just a very large, complex company, a government, a country, and you've got to operate on the same principles. And the way that particularly the Singaporeans have done it with education and everything else is much better than most companies ever manage.
What can you pull from the work that you've done that could be applied to the entrepreneur sector? I think both from a systematic perspective, but also from, the lessons that the entrepreneurs themselves have to take on board in order to meet this challenge, which has been exacerbated by COVID-19.
I mean, speaking very personally at one level, and I'll speak a little bit about policy, but speaking very personally, I mean, I think my most abiding lessons are really that your eyes never lie. So get out there and see things for yourself. Take them in, use your eyes, ears, and mouth and the ratio that God gave them to you, and learn, watch and learn, and observe and learn. And that relates to a second aspect, which is, you know, it's the combination of humility and humor, which I say is often my best, strongest kind of suite, which is invaluable because it enables you to build relationships. You know, and I think that in this modern world where everybody can connect via Zoom or via whatever platform, and we are inundated with digital communication, um, that those relationships are much more of a premium than ever before. So I would say to business people, really get to know your partners, really get to know the country in which you operate, and do the bicycle ride if you can. Speak with authority and speak with humility, and you know, always have a joke you know, close at hand, and definitely one that's self-deprecating. And most business people tend to be slightly less on the deprecation side than more on the ego side. So swallow some of that, I would argue. On policy-related issues, I mean, I think running a business is not unlike, as I said before, running a company. You know, you've got to have the basics right. You, in a sense, got to seek macro stability. The figures seldom lie in this context. You know, I think for me, particularly, the investment in education and skills, the investment in knowledge, and then the sort of pursuit of growth in a way that enables it to be inclusive is the mark of a long-term business. So, you know, if you're pursuing growth as an inclusive agent in countries, you're more stable. You're pursuing growth as an inclusive agent in companies, they tend to be much longer lasting, more of an evergreen nature. And you know, productivity is of course the flip side of education, skills, knowledge, looking after people. And I really, you know, sometimes I think my colleagues wear of me the long evenings listening to people taking you out in strange places, eating strange food. That's enormous money in the bank, and those, when you come back, certainly for myself, those are the moments that you treasure more than any other. So I think the one thing is this knowledge aspect, and the other is humility and humor. You know, good businesses will stack up in financial terms. Running them for a long period of time is going to require models, particularly post-COVID, which I think are probably going to adjust somewhat. When the world is not perhaps quite as globalized as it was before. We have a different set of values. Lifestyle's more important. You know, maybe health is new wealth. We're more worried about human security. We're more worried about food security than we were before. We have different consumer outlooks. We're not going to travel quite so much. We may be more discreet in terms of where we travel to. Those things I think are going to play into business. So make those long-term relationships, and they're the ones that are going to last. You know, I can just say personally that when I was at university, I was very lucky to sort of be mentored by, and they probably still regret the day, but to be mentored by a few very, I mean, truly exceptional people that I still, except in one or two cases because they passed away, I mean, I've kept in touch with, you know, throughout, and people who were able to give me a lot more than I deserved. And I think the same is true in business. You know, as much as you put in is as much as you get out.
There we go. That's better. It's a lot better on my side anyway.
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, good. And it's it's a bit of a hack. I mean, I can show you. I have like I have my cooler box and old school art books, and everything's packed up in the corner right next to the router. So this is what we're reduced to.
Have you drunk all that wine behind you, or you
I've been
your way
trying
through
to.
it?
No, let me tell you, I've got quite a few friends who are offering to help me. Let me just put that out there. I and actually, not just friends, my freaking family. My cousin arrived the other day, and he literally just rocked up here, and I said to him, "Dude, you're not actually allowed here." But he was like, "I need some of that wine that you have. I know that you have." So I think people are getting a little bit antsy at the moment. When Cyril announced that liquor was being sold again, I was actually quite happy for various reasons, you know.